What would you do if the only thing standing between you and oblivion was a dead woman's chisel? We've been thinking about that question for a long time, because the answer, the real answer, isn't what most people expect. It isn't courage, exactly. It isn't cleverness. It's something quieter and harder to name. Stay with us a little while, and we'll tell you about Juniper Slate and what she found inside a lighthouse that hadn't been opened in 60 years. Juniper Slate arrived in the harbor town of Crabapple Cove on the eastern shore of Cape Breton Island on the first morning of October, with a canvas satchel on one shoulder, a chisel wrapped in flannel in her coat pocket, and the particular kind of hollow behind her eyes that belongs to people who have recently lost the last person who loved them. She was 22 years old. She had $11.40 to her name, and she had nowhere, not a single place on the whole broad face of the earth, that she could honestly call home. Her grandmother, Verity Slate, had died in late August, not dramatically, not with any great fuss. She had simply set down her mallet one afternoon in her small stone workshop behind the house on Birch Hollow Road, sat herself in the old ladder-back chair by the window, and decided she had done enough. The landlord had given Juniper 2 weeks to collect her things and leave. The house had never been theirs to begin with, only rented, and without Verity's pension there was no money for rent. There was no other family. There was no plan. What there was, tucked into the flannel alongside the chisel, was a letter. Verity had written it some months before, in her firm, economical hand, and left it in the top drawer of the workshop cabinet, beneath a curl of cedar shavings and an old tobacco tin. Juniper had found it on the last day when she was clearing the tools. The letter said 3 things. It said that the chisel had belonged to Verity's own teacher, a woman named Charlotte Blyth, who had been the finest stone carver in the province. It said that the craft was now Juniper's to carry forward, that she had the hands for it and the patience, and that those 2 things were rarer than people knew. And it said, in the final line, in handwriting that was slightly less steady than the rest, "Go to Crabapple Cove. Ask about the Dunmore light. The answer is in the stone." Juniper had read the letter 4 times on the bus. She had not the faintest idea what it meant. Crabapple Cove was not a cheerful place in October. The summer people had gone, taking their kayaks and their money with them, and what remained was the town's actual self. Salt-weathered clapboard, lobster traps stacked in yards, a single main street that smelled of brine and diesel, and something faintly sweet from the bakery on the corner. The off-season population was perhaps 300. The sky was the color of a worn dish rag, and the wind off the water had teeth. She found a room above the hardware store, offered by a stocky, squint-eyed man named Donald Purdy, who asked no questions beyond whether she could pay the first week up front. She could, barely. She paid him. The room's small and cold and had a window that looked directly at the wall of the building next door, but it had a bed and a working radiator, and that was enough. Juniper had learned, in the months since her grandmother's health had begun to fail, not to need very much. She spent the first 2 days listening. That was her way, always had been. Verity had taught her that the best carvers listened to the stone before they ever touched it. You had to learn what was already inside before you could think about what to take away. The same was true of towns, of rooms, of people. So she took her meals at the one diner that was still open, a narrow place called the Herringbone, and she drank her tea slowly, and she listened. The town talked about the weather. It talked about the price of lobster, and who had sold their boat, and whether the council would fix the road out to the point before winter. And, sometimes, in the particular way that people speak about things they've agreed not to speak about directly, it talked around something else. A shape in the conversation, a hole where a subject should be. Juniper noticed it the way she noticed a flaw in a piece of limestone, by the way everything else arranged itself around it. The Dunmore light. She heard it mentioned twice in those first 2 days, both times in passing, both times followed by a small silence and a change of subject. Once from Donald Purdy, who said to someone on the phone that he hoped the Heritage Board would stop poking around that old light before somebody got hurt. Once from an elderly woman in the diner who said, to her companion, that her late husband had always said the Dunmore business was better left to God and the sea. On the 3rd morning, Juniper walked to the end of the main street and asked the girl behind the counter at the bakery if she knew where the Dunmore Lighthouse was. The girl, who could not have been more than 17, looked up with the frank curiosity of someone who had not yet learned to be guarded. The old one or the new one? Old one, Juniper said, because that seemed right. Out past Setter's Wharf, the girl said. End of the headland road. You can't drive right up to it. The road washed out years ago. But it's there. The new light's automated, runs itself. The old one's been locked up since. She stopped, tilted her head. Since a long time ago. Why? My grandmother told me to come here, Juniper said. It was the simplest true thing she could say. The girl studied her for a moment with those frank young eyes. Then she said, "You should talk to Mr. Aubrey Fenn. He was the last keeper's assistant. He's old now, but he remembers everything." Aubrey Fenn lived in a low white house 3 streets back from the water, surrounded by a garden that had gone to seed for the season, but showed in its bones the evidence of serious tending. He answered the door himself, a slight man in his late 70s, with a face like old dock planking, creased and silvered, and somehow still solid. He looked at Juniper for a moment with eyes the particular blue of sea glass, and then he stood back and held the door open without saying a word. She sat at his kitchen table while he made tea, and she told him about her grandmother and the letter. She set the chisel on the table between them, still wrapped in its flannel. When she unfolded the cloth, Aubrey Fenn's hands went still over the teapot. He looked at the chisel for a long moment. Then he sat down. "That belonged to Charlotte Blyth," he said. It was not a question. "That's what my grandmother wrote," Juniper said. He looked at her carefully. "Your grandmother was Verity Slate." "Yes." A silence settled between them, the particular kind of silence that carries weight. Aubrey Fenn wrapped both hands around his mug of tea and looked out the window at his empty garden. "Charlotte Blyth was the stone carver who built the interior of the Dunmore Light," he said at last. "The original interior, the decorative work in the base chamber, the carved lintel above the lamp room door, the memorial stone in the keeper's quarters. She did all of it, back in 1923. She was 26 years old, and she had apprenticed under her own teacher since she was 15. She was the finest hand in the province." He paused. "She died in 1961, and her estate was settled by a solicitor's office in Halifax, and apparently not settled very well, because certain things that ought to have been properly documented were not." "What things?" Juniper asked. Aubrey Fenn looked at her again in that steady, appraising way. "Charlotte Blyth was commissioned to do the carving work for a flat fee," he said. She agreed. But the man who commissioned her, the man who held the heritage contract for the Lighthouse, was a speculator named Reginald Good. He owned the contract, and he owned the building company, and when Charlotte's carved lintel turned out to be of significant historical and artistic value, he filed an amended claim saying the work was done as a hired hand, under his direction, and that the copyright and all derivative rights belonged to his company. He set down his mug. Charlotte contested it. She had her notes, her sketches, her correspondence. But Reginald Good had better lawyers, and by the time she died, the matter had never been properly resolved. Juniper felt something shift quietly in her chest. And now, Aubrey Fenn said carefully, "Reginald Good's grandson, a man named Preston Good, has applied to the Heritage Board to have the interior of the Dunmore Light designated as part of his family's artistic legacy. There is a significant grant attached to that designation, significant enough that several people in this town have found it in their interest to support his application." He looked at the chisel on the table. "Charlotte left her papers to your grandmother. Did you know that? They were friends, all their lives. Charlotte trusted Verity with them." Juniper felt the cold settle into her more deeply than the October wind could account for. "I didn't know," she said. "My grandmother never told me." "Verity may not have known what to do with them," Aubrey said. "Or she may have been waiting for the right moment. Or the right person." He glanced at the chisel. "Charlotte left one other thing. She told Verity that the proof of her authorship was built into the lighthouse itself. Hidden in the stone, she carved her initials and the year into the hidden face of the memorial stone in the keeper's quarters, the face that was mortared against the wall. She also, and this is the part that matters, left a record of the exact measurements and placement of every carved element. Measurements that no one who had not done the work themselves could possibly have produced. She wrote it all out in a notebook, and she gave the notebook to the one person she thought would understand what to do with it." He paused. "We believe she gave it to Verity, and we believe Verity hid it somewhere before she died." Juniper sat very still. She thought about the workshop, the cabinet, the cedar shavings, the tobacco tin she had set aside without looking inside. She had left it in the room when she packed. She did not say this to Aubrey Fenn, not yet. She was her grandmother's student, and her grandmother's rule had been, "Understand what you have before you show it to anyone." She thanked him. She said she would need to think. She walked back to her room above Donald Purdy's hardware store, and she sat on the edge of her narrow bed for a long time without moving. Then she opened her satchel and took out the tobacco tin. Inside, beneath a folded square of waxed cotton, was a small notebook, no larger than the palm of her hand, with a brown cover and a brass clasp. The paper inside was thin as onion skin and covered in Charlotte Blyth's handwriting, a fine, deliberate script that moved across the page like something carved rather than written. Measurements and notations, angle marks and depth records, and at the very back, a single page in a different tone of ink, added later, that read, "For verity, the light keeps the truth. Do not let good take what was never his. We want you to understand something about the moment that followed, because it matters." Juniper Slate was 22 years old and alone, in a cold rented room, in a town where she knew exactly one person, and she was holding a notebook that might be worth a great deal to the right people, and absolutely nothing to the wrong ones. She had $11 left after paying her second week's rent. She had a chisel and a notebook and a grandmother's faith in her hands. She could have sold it. Not to Preston Good. She didn't know him yet, and she wouldn't have trusted him if she had. But to the Heritage Board, perhaps, or to a journalist. She could have turned it over to Aubrey Fenn and let older and steadier hands manage the rest. She could have simply mailed it to a lawyer in Halifax and walked away. She thought about all of those things. And then she thought about her grandmother, sitting in that ladder-back chair, with her hands folded in her lap, deciding she had done enough. And she thought about Charlotte Blyth, who had built something real and lasting and true into the stone of that lighthouse, and then spent years watching someone else claim it. And she thought about the chisel in her coat pocket, worn smooth at the handle by 3 pairs of hands now, and the weight of it, which had always felt like a kind of company. She didn't walk away. She needed to get inside the lighthouse. This was not simple. The Dunmore Light had been locked since 1978, when the automation of the new tower had made it redundant. The Heritage Board held the key. The Heritage Board also, as Aubrey Fenn had intimated, contained several members who were sympathetic to Preston Good's application, which made requesting formal access a risk she wasn't prepared to take. Not yet. Not before she knew what she had. She went back to Aubrey Fenn the next morning. She told him about the tobacco tin. She watched his face as she said it, and she saw, in the set of his jaw, a controlled and private satisfaction, the look of a man who has been waiting a very long time for something to come right. He did not crow. He did not reach for the notebook. He simply nodded. "There's a man named Stuart Doak," he said. "He did maintenance on the old light for the municipality for 30 years, until they contracted it out. He knows every board and bolt in that building. He'll know if there's a way in that doesn't require the Heritage Board's key." Stuart Doak was a big, deliberate man who had the permanently wind-burned look of someone who had spent most of his life outdoors, and didn't see the point in apologizing for it. He ran a small carpentry and repair shop out of a converted garage on the edge of town. Juniper found him replacing a window frame and stood quietly until he was at a stopping point before she spoke. She had learned that too from her grandmother. You don't interrupt a person in the middle of their work. He listened to her without looking up from what he was doing. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The east door has a warped frame. Key still works, but you have to know how to lift the door and turn at the same time. I've been the only person who knew that trick since 1984. He set down his putty knife. "Aubrey Fenn sent you, did he?" "He suggested you might be willing to help," Juniper said. Stuart Doak looked at her for the first time. He looked at the chisel she was holding, because she had taken it out of her pocket as she was talking, the way she always did when she was thinking hard, turning it in her hands. He looked at her face. "Charlotte Blyth was my great-aunt," he said. Not loudly, just as a plain fact he was setting on the table between them. "Her name's been dragged around this town for 30 years by the Good family, and I am tired of it." He picked up his putty knife again. "I'll take you out there Friday morning. Wear good boots." The headland road was exactly as advertised. Impassable by car, barely passable on foot, a rutted track that dissolved into mud and loose stone as it climbed toward the point. They walked in single file, Juniper and Stuart Doak, and the wind came in off the Atlantic in cold, steady gusts that smelled of open water, and something older underneath, kelp and salt, and the particular mineral smell of wet rock. The lighthouse emerged from the sea mist as they came over the last rise. Juniper stopped. She had seen photographs of lighthouses, of course, every Canadian child had. But photographs had not prepared her for the particular quality of the Dunmore Light in person. It was old. Not picturesque old, not heritage plaque old, but genuinely, structurally old, in the way that certain stone buildings are when they have absorbed a century of weather and work and solitude. The tower was dark gray granite, 60 feet high, and it rose from the headland with the unapologetic permanence of something that had never expected to be noticed, only to be useful. There was lichen on the lower courses and rust staining around the ironwork of the lamp gallery. There was a crack in the east wall that someone had repointed, carefully at some point in the past. At the base of the tower was a low stone annex, the keeper's quarters. The east door was set into it, wooden, painted the original red, though the paint had faded to something closer to the color of dried blood. Stuart Doak lifted the door and turned the key in one practiced motion. The door opened. Inside smelled of cold stone and time. The kind of cold that doesn't vary with the seasons, that lives in the walls. That is a property of the building rather than the weather. Juniper pulled her jacket closer and followed Stuart into the main chamber of the annex. The room was bare, stripped of everything movable. The furniture, the fittings, the small personal effects of the last keeper's tenure. What remained was the stone itself, and in the stone the work. Even in the dim light that came through the single salt-hazed window, Juniper could see it. The carved lintel above the inner door, the decorative keystones in the four corners of the ceiling, the surround of the old fireplace, carved in a running pattern of waves and kelp, and something she recognized instinctively as a stylized map of the coastline. It was not ornate. It was not decorative in the showy sense. It was precise and deeply intelligent, the work of a person who understood stone the way other people understood language, as something capable of meaning, something capable of lasting. She stood there for a moment and just let herself look. Then she crossed to the far wall. The memorial stone was there, as Aubrey Fenn had described it, a single rectangular slab set into the wall about shoulder height, carved with the names of the keepers who had served the light from 1891 to 1978. She ran her fingers along the mortar at the edges. It was old mortar, brittle at the surface, and she could feel, with the sensitivity that years of stonework had built into her fingertips, that the stone was not fully bedded. There was a slight give. The back face was accessible, or could be, with the right tool and the right care. She took out the chisel. She worked slowly. She was not trying to dislodge the stone, only to ease the mortar enough at one edge to allow her to slide a thin piece of card against the back face. Stuart Doak stood back and watched without speaking. He had the watchful patience of a carpenter who understood that certain operations could not be hurried. It took 40 minutes. At the end of 40 minutes, she had worked the upper right corner of the stone, free enough to slide her phone into the gap, camera facing in, and take 3 photographs. She stepped back. She looked at the photographs. In the lower right corner of the hidden face of the memorial stone, carved cleanly into the granite in letters perhaps a centimeter high, were the initials CB and the year 1923. Stuart Doak came and looked over her shoulder. He didn't say anything. His jaw tightened once, briefly, and then he exhaled through his nose and nodded. "There it is," he said. It was not a triumphant moment, precisely. It was something quieter and more complicated than triumph. It was the feeling of a thing that had been wrong for a very long time becoming, in a small and partial way, right. It was the feeling of proof. And proof, Juniper was beginning to understand, was not just about the law or the record or the Heritage Board's decision. It was about the simple dignity of a true account, about a woman who had built something real being allowed, at last, to stand behind her work. What happened next took time, as true things do. Juniper brought the photographs and the notebook to Aubrey Fenn. Aubrey Fenn brought them to a lawyer in Sydney, a woman named Deirdre McIvor, who specialized in heritage and intellectual property disputes, and who, as it happened, had heard Preston Good's name before, in contexts that had not impressed her. Deirdre McIvor brought them to the Heritage Board, not in the form of a request, but in the form of a formal submission of countervailing evidence. Preston Good, who was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with the easy confidence of someone who had never been seriously contradicted, appeared before the board in November with his own lawyer and a folder of documents his grandfather had kept. He was not, when he entered the room, expecting a serious challenge. His grandfather's papers showed payment records, correspondence, project notes. They showed that Reginald Good had managed the Lighthouse project in every administrative sense. What they did not show was the thing that Juniper, standing quietly at the back of the room, understood. The difference between managing a project and building something true. Deirdre McIvor presented the notebook, the photographs, and a short statement from Aubrey Fenn, who was 80 years old and had been waiting 30 years to give it. She presented a structural analysis from a conservation specialist in Halifax who had compared the measurements in the notebook against the actual carved elements and confirmed. with the precision of someone who worked in fractions of millimeters, that no one could have written those notations without being the person who had done the work. She presented the chisel. She explained its provenance. Charlotte Blyth to Verity Slate to Juniper, and she explained what the wear pattern on the blade indicated to anyone who understood the mechanics of stone carving, that it had been used extensively on a soft-grade granite consistent with the stone of the Dunmore Light, and used by someone with a left-handed grip, as Charlotte Blyth was known to have been. Preston Good's lawyer objected. Preston Good himself leaned over and said something to his lawyer in a low voice, and the lawyer said something back, and Juniper watched his face change, the easy confidence draining away, replaced by something stiffer and more careful. The board chair, a gray-haired woman named Elspeth Rennie, who had the bearing of someone who had seen a great many people try to claim things that weren't theirs, read through the submission twice before she spoke. Then she said, simply and finally, that the application from the Good family was denied, and that the documented record of Charlotte Blyth's authorship of the carved elements of the Dunmore Light would be entered into the Heritage Register under her name. She said this without editorializing. She didn't need to. Preston Good left the building without speaking to anyone. The lawyer shook Deirdre McIver's hand with the professional courtesy of a man who understood he'd lost and had decided to be gracious about it. Aubrey Fenn, sitting in the second row, put his hands on his knees and closed his eyes for a moment. Stuart Doak, who had come and stood at the back alongside Juniper, let out a long, slow breath. Juniper stood in the cold November air outside the Heritage Board office and felt the Atlantic wind come in off the water and the weight of the chisel in her coat pocket. She thought about her grandmother in that ladder-back chair. She thought about Charlotte Blyth, working alone in a cold lighthouse in 1923, carving her name into the back of a stone, because she knew enough about the world to understand that the front face might not be enough. She thought about the particular kind of courage it took to hide a truth inside something permanent and trust that the right person would eventually come looking. We've thought about that a lot since we heard this story. The courage of the hidden mark, the faith that stone outlasts argument. Juniper Slate did not become wealthy from what she found in the Dunmore Light. The notebook and the photographs belonged to the historical record, and she gave them to the Heritage Board. The carving work itself belonged to the Lighthouse, which belonged to the community, as it should. What she received was a different kind of inheritance. Deirdre McIver, who was building a new office in Sydney and had been looking for a stonecutter with the skill to carve a proper lintel, offered her the commission. Stuart Doak, who had a workshop that was larger than he needed and whose great-aunt had spent her life believing that craft deserved to be passed on, offered her a working space for the winter. Aubrey Fenn, who had no family nearby, offered her a standing invitation to dinner on Sunday evenings. She stayed in Crabapple Cove through the winter. She carved the lintel for Deirdre McIver's office, and it was good work, the best she had done, because she was working in a place where she understood what work meant and what it was worth. The chisel moved through the stone the way her grandmother had taught her it should, listening first, then speaking. By spring, she had enough saved for 2 months' proper rent. She had her tools, her skill, her growing reputation in a small town that had learned, at some cost, to take craftsmanship seriously. She was not settled, exactly. 22 is too young to be settled. But she was planted, and there is a difference. On the last day before the spring thaw broke properly, she walked out to the headland one more time, alone. The lighthouse stood where it always had, gray and patient against the gray-blue sky, its lamp turning in its slow automated circle. She stood at the east door and put her hand against the stone of the wall, the way her grandmother had taught her, palm flat, still, feeling for what was already there. The stone was cold. The stone was old. The stone held its stories the way stone always does, without apology, without embellishment, precisely as they were. She stood there for a while. Then she turned and walked back down the headland road toward town. Her boots loud on the gravel, the chisel warm from her hand in her coat pocket. We'll leave you with the question we started with, the one that brought us to Juniper's story in the first place. What would you do if the only proof of a true thing was something hidden, something someone else had trusted you to find? Would you go looking? Would you know how to look? Tell us in the comments below, and if this story stayed with you the way it stayed with us, we'd love for you to be here for the next one.